You know why the sun never sets on the British Empire? It is because God doesn't trust the English in the dark.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking again to Professor Michael Brenner, who's an Emeritus Professor of International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. He's been on this channel before, so I'm sure many of you know him. Michael, thank you very much for joining me again.
Well, it's a pleasure to be back with you, Pascal. Looking forward to it.
Well, we want to discuss today a topic that we've been talking about for the last couple times, but we never got to focus on it. So we said we're going to do an in-depth discussion on morality in international affairs or world politics. Michael, is there something like morality in world politics, or in what sense can we talk about it? Because the world seems extremely cruel, especially right now in December 2023.
Well, I think the answer to that is a qualified yes. Qualified yes, which speaks not in terms of categorical imperatives or fixed standards of ethical conduct, but in terms of what Max Weber called the ethic of responsibility. But let's just sort of back up for a minute and try and address and actually to set aside some common presumptions about human nature and humans in society and the alleged propensity to commit violent acts. That's quite common, and there are many who say, well, the reason why you have war and why you have all of the abuses, like the killing and the auxiliary abuses that are associated with war, is because human beings are by nature violent creatures. That's really not quite true, or certainly has to be restated.
And that is the realist dogma, right? The realists claim, at least one part of the school claims humans are violent, therefore.
No, I think the realists actually are more structuralists. They believe it's in the structure of international relations. The fact that it deals with relations among autonomous political units, each of which has the right and the prerogative of deciding when it might go to war, under what circumstances and how to be conducted. And so while I think the realists would say war in any particular situation is not inevitable, it's the structure of the international system or non-system, in fact, which is permissive of war and violent conflict. In other words, they would say that conflict situations are ubiquitous. Wars are not necessarily, any particular war is not inevitable, and because it's circumstances as well as individual judgments and decisions which determine whether there is violent conflict. But there are others, take a more, what I was suggesting, a behavioral approach that says human beings are violent. They're not really. We're capable of every form of behavior. We certainly have no drive to commit violent acts. There are people who often, say that, but in fact, there's no equivalent or counterpart to the sex drive, for example. Human beings can live quite happily and fully satisfied if they're not engaged in violent conflict. And in this sense, the hobby and vision is mistaken and misconceived. In our Neolithic or even Paleolithic times, we lived in small groups of 15 to 30. And you had the combination of both peaceful intercourse and potentials for conflict. Within the group, peace reigned because you had the natural bonds which inhibit acts of violence. And in a small social grouping like that, acts of violence are so dysfunctional. There's a common recognition we can't survive if we have fights and if people get hurt or people get killed and so forth. And then when you dealt with other tribes, so with anthropologists would explain, you can get a variety of relations. You get cooperation, they could ignore each other, or they might compete violently for territory, for gaming rights, etc. As we moved into larger societies, then what would be the substitute for the kind of natural bonding that would take place in a very simple primitive community of 20 or 30? It still exists among some tribes in the Amazon basin, and until recently in parts of Africa. And so what you got was the codification of behavioral norms, right? And every organized society sort of has them. In other words, it takes the logic and the principle of peaceful collaboration among members of the tribe and tries to transform it and transmute it, if you like, into generalized behavioral norms within a much larger grouping in which we don't know the vast majority, we don't know personally and have no direct contact with a larger majority of other members of the society. And that's the basis for law and rules. And every organized society has them. And the most striking thing, of course, is that in every organized society, even, that action which is most expressly prohibited and the prohibition on which is enforced is violence, is murder or assault.
Yeah, I would just like to add that I believe the case can at least be made that even if we argue that violence is part of human nature, that non-violence and kindness, the opposite, is just as strongly embedded in human nature. Exactly. Because we see both of that in everyday life. And it must have happened to everybody here that you were invited to a stranger's house and the first thing they ask you is, have you eaten? Do you want something to drink? We have a natural tendency to be kind to others, although we also see the inverse when couples are fighting and are become violent. We see violence in the most close of relationships emerge. So it can happen, but to claim that it is our natural state would definitely be a crass overstatement, I believe. So the question then becomes why it is that in these larger groups, sometimes we outlaw war and sometimes we make violence. Why do we sometimes outlaw violence and why do we sometimes make it a virtue, right? It is quite interesting that we have both. We say violence is bad, but you go back to any kind of society, you always find that there's some ritualization of violence. Now, sacrifices. We have, of course, we completely utterly agree that the police can be violent because they are violent for a good cause, right? In order to protect society. Imprisoning people is an act of violence, but we say there's this group of people who can rightfully, justly do so. And when it then comes to the issue of war, it even becomes a great virtue, right? It's mind-boggling to me, all of these movies in the United States, like American Sniper or really crass movies that glorify people who are very good at killing others, right, in very brutal circumstances, and that is then held up as a model case for a good patriot. And then we see the inversion of the usual virtue of being a good citizen, being a good Christian, into of being the more you can kill, the better you are. Why do you think that this very ambivalence towards violence exists in our societies?
Well, here again, as you noted, we have to recognize the variety in national cultures, not in national state cultures or large social collectivities. And they vary very much in terms of their attitude towards organized violence, which is what war is. I mean, you've had martial societies like Sparta in antiquity in Greece. One talks about the Prussian tradition of militarism, and you have other cultures in which the disposition and was not seen as virtuous and was not really integral to the collective national personality. So what we're really getting at is, or the conclusion is, that war above all is a social phenomenon. It has to be understood as the emanation of a society and the interactions between or among society. And the proximate causes can be any variety of things, right? It can be a dispute over territory, a desire to acquire or to defend territory. It can be ideological, or sometimes it can be, in rare instances, purely martial. And there are some cultures and some societies in which the idea of conquest and domination of others is integral to it. One thinks of Attila's Huns, one thinks of Genghis Khan's Golden Horde, one thinks of Tamerlane. And of course, the extremity of this would be Nazi Germany. But let's set that modern deformation aside for a moment. Although, by the way, recent scholarship suggests that all of these historical movements out of Central Asia, which in their most took their most violent expression in the form of the Huns and the Genghis Khans, etc., was due to climatic changes. And so the great grasslands of Central Asia would periodically dry up. And so they had to move westward. And that brought them into conflict with other groupings and other tribes, probably contributed to what already was a martial culture. But things, and so I think we have to place the question of war, organized violence, in both a social context, and you could say even an environmental or even, in essence, an ecological context, and also in a technological context, because we might get into the notion that morality in one form or another and its application insofar as we're talking about the conduct of states, shifted and changed and has continued to be transformed by changes in technology.
Yeah,
we can get into that in a minute or two. I mean, the inhibition or the lack of interest in using violent force against civilians. Let's contrast the wars, European wars between the end of the religious wars, the 30 Years' Wars, and up through most of the 19th century, were between professional armies, right, which interested themselves very little in the civilian populations which surrounded them, except for one provisioning. Right? And the risk to civilians really came from two sources: possible plunder by unruly armies, and disease and famine, which might result as the indirect consequence of fighting, as occurred in the 30 Years' War. Otherwise, when you look at the wars, for example, of the 18th century, the civilians, except for the Spanish guerrilla war against Napoleon, which was, I guess, 19th century, very few civilians were really killed. And so we're going to pose the question: why has the whole issue of civilian deaths and very large numbers, and the morality associated with it is so pertinent today.
Yeah, I mean, we're already getting down into a deeper level, because we definitely developed norms of warfare, right? This is unquestionable. I mean, and we will talk about this. Just war theory is development of warfare, war norms. International law, of course, Grotius and so on, and there's different components to this development of norms around organized, collective, large-scale violence. And one of the norms developed is that civilians should be off the table, right? Should not be actually attacked. Although then the question always is who counts as a civilian and who doesn't. So we accept that in the 19th century, yes, warfare within Europe tried more or less to spare civilians, but if you look at the African continent and the American continents, there the people were not considered not even considered human, right? Therefore the whole concept doesn't apply. So the group always decides who does it recognize as a fitting counterpart and not. But if we just one more step back, the idea of organized violence between groups, you pointed out technology and well, norms and ideas. I just also want to point out that one thing might be just also the sheer ability, the possibility that something can happen. What I mean with that is at the moment I'm at a point where I say that the only thing that determines what states do is what they can do and what they want to do. Those are the two factors. And then the question is, what influences the wanting, which includes norms, and what influences the can, that would be technological abilities, right? So warfare abilities and so on. You can break that and say, like, okay, it's not just states, but let's talk about more ancient times, the groups that have the weapons, and what controls them. Then the question, though, becomes, are these groups under conscious control or not? Is the can do and the want do something that actually is influenced by the members, or is the social networks of the members such that the can and the want are independent of any individual in the group? If it is independent, then we have an emergent property that the can and the want are especially the want are not dependent on an individual but on the group. And there's a very nice expression that was coined by the British YouTuber, what's his name, Russell Brand. He said in a very short sentence, in his regular very fast talking, he used the expression, these people are like the fleas on the back of the dog of war. And the dog of war just carries people away. And we think that the Bidens and the Putins and the Xis are in control, but actually they're nothing but the fleas on the back of the dog of war. And the dog of war goes wherever it wants. So do you have a view about this one?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would put it somewhat differently. And I don't... Well, first, let's go back to your neat formulation between having, the means and whether you have the intent. I mean, this gets back, of course, to the standard formula of homicide detectives and those who write mysteries, and that is motive, means, and opportunity. Motives can vary, as we said. That another way of saying that the proximate causes of any particular conflict are as numerous as there have been wars. That's motivation. The means and the opportunity has been constant, and this is the addition that in a world composed of and populated by independent political units, each of which has the right to decide when and under what circumstances it might resort to violence against neighbors or others. That's the opportunity. The means of changes, and I think the change in means has altered our conception of morality. Let me just get into it briefly, anyway. Okay, we're talking about the professional armies of the 18th century. who fought, which by today's standards would be very limited wars. I mean, limited in terms of geographical scope, limited in terms of the manpower, limited even in terms of casualties in absolute terms, if not in relative or proportionate terms. What's changed, of course, as we think of, is that by the 20th century, when you get to the 20th century, we're talking about total war. Why is it total war? Well, not because the opportunities have changed, not necessarily the motives, but because the ability to mobilize force and to employ it depends upon the capacities of the whole society. Its economy, its productive means, its industry, and so forth. So, I mean, the logical corollary to that is that if the strength and the power of a protagonist, of all the protagonists, is dependent upon the sort of features of and attributes of society as a whole, they should become, and they do become, legitimate targets. And that's why you began to get in World War I the direct targeting of civilian infrastructure, because it wasn't just civilian, it was also military. Industrial plants, the workers who use those, work at the machines that produce the weapons and so on and so forth. And simultaneously, you have the development of means to reach them, airplanes.
Yeah.
And so the combination of the two, I mean, total war, in the sense that war now in strength depends upon the industrial and economic capacities of the whole society and the means to attack them. And then that leads to the kind of mass assaults on civilian populations in World War II, Rotterdam, Coventry, all the German cities which the Allies bombed, the firebombing of Tokyo, and the ultimate end is in the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So what happens to traditional notions of self-restraint as the key feature of an ethic of responsibility under those circumstances? Let's go back. I have here the five ingredients of what conditions are supposed to constitute or justify a just war. Should I read them?
Wait a second. I absolutely agree. We do that, but I just want to add one thing about what you said, because while I agree that total war, the way that it was fought in the First and then the Second World War, might have been new in its technological sense, I don't entirely agree that it was new. I mean, the entire history of war has always been total in the sense that every great general understood that if you can just cut off the enemy army from its supplies, the enemy army is going to die. That's the entire idea of besieging a city, right? You besiege the entirety of an of a system that helps your enemy. It was Napoleon. Napoleon tried to isolate the Britain, and Britain tried to isolate Napoleon on the continent. This blockade idea, and it's very, very old. So, and we have in international law even 700 years of ideas of how blockades work, when is it legal, when not. The idea that you target civilian infrastructure and civilian supply routes is ancient. And for my studies of neutrality, it's particularly important because it impacts these third actors, right? That then demand, hey guys, I'm not at war with you or you. I still have a right to trade with both of you. But then both of them usually tell the third party, bugger off, you can trade with me, but certainly not with the other guy. And we have an entire system that developed around this one. So the totality, to me, whenever war becomes extremely serious, it always escalates into more and more total forms. And we see that right now. I mean, also in the war, Russia and Ukraine, right? How the West is trying actually to defeat Russia, not by fighting on the ground, but by fighting fighting it in completely different realms, especially economically. This spectacularly failed. It absolutely produced the opposite effect. But the intent to actually take the fight to ordinary Russians it was very clearly pronounced from the beginning. So in a sense, I do think that war has a very total aspect to it. Or it's harder to find examples when war wasn't total than when it did spiral into totality.
Well, I think you make a very good point, about the interest that states in conflict and war had to limit access to supplies. But at the same time, I think we should kind of bear in mind that, first of all, the reach tended to be geographically limited. Certainly on land, it was very limited. On sea, it was wider and larger, and the use of blockade in the continental system during the Napoleonic Wars, I mean, that does have a geographical reach. But there was no capacity, no ability to reach the actual producers of the foodstuffs or whatever.
But that's the inability of the can. They couldn't, therefore they didn't. Yeah, had they been able to, they would have.
The means, yes. But let's, compare that again to the attack on cities in World War II.
Yeah.
Which began or was justified in terms of the value of destroying factories, infrastructure, railroad yards, so on and so forth, but then very quickly turned into a campaign against civilian populations themselves, in the belief, sometimes stated, sometimes left unstated, but by the end of the war clearly stated, that if you could punish a population enough, the whole country would become demoralized.
Yeah, break their will.
Yeah, one, you would have demoralization, and also, along with the demoralization, the populace would turn on their government, which had brought them into such a horrendous state of affairs, if you like. Now, of course, both of those have historically proven to be false. We know in almost every case, whether it be Britain or Germany or the Soviet Union, attacks on population centers tend to strengthen sense of collective identity and harden a readiness to continue to fight the war. And the populace really did not turn on their leaders in any of those instances. Now, more recently, the same era of analysis and judgment, has been made. Think of the sort of far-fetched, some would say, harebrained notion that if we could apply severe economic sanctions to Russia, the populace would be, and combined with casualties from the battlefields in Ukraine, the populace would become so alienated from the leaders, so angry with leadership, that they would topple the current regime, the current leadership, bring back a sober Yeltsin, who in turn would invite the West back in to plunder Russian resources, and everyone would live happily ever after. I mean, of course, this is based upon profound ignorance, bordering on idiocy, but that was one of the main strands of thinking in Washington assimilated and accepted by our brave European allies, uh, which led to the all-out commitment to defeat Russia. In one fact, you can say it wasn't just to defend Ukraine, because the Ukrainian military forces in place at that time were about to assault the Donbass, and the Russian attack was essentially preemptive. And the goal was not just to restore the Donbass to control by the Kiev government, because frankly, nobody in Washington, very few people in Washington then or now, really care very much about the welfare of Ukrainians.
Yeah.
And we've said it enough. Keep them fighting as long as you can, just to weaken Russia. If you lose 500,000 people, it's not a concern of ours, but rather the overarching goal was to get rid of Putin and to permanently marginalize Russia from European affairs as a power, and to neuter it.
Yeah, and it's
as a power.
The economic weapon. This failed, but the economic weapon, that just today on foreign policy, there's another one of these ludicrous articles. The people keep thinking that this could work, and that you can turn even the elite in Russia against its leadership. I also want to point out that you used the words a sober Yeltsin, which is beautifully an oxymoron on several levels, but that also the misunderstanding, of course, that the Yeltsin years were the worst years for Russia since the Great Purge of the in the late 30s. I mean, since the Second World War, right? I mean, it has never been as bad for Russians in the Soviet Union as it has been then on the Yeltsin for them. So of course, Russia wouldn't want ordinary Russians wouldn't want that back, and of course the Russians understand firsthand what it is like when the country that you live in breaks apart into several pieces, and that the West then even articulates this as one possible outcome and goal of the entire endeavor. I mean, the level of audacity in the West to think that kind of signaling would be picked up positively by the population in Russia is just quite amazing. But that brings us back to the question, then what motivates these dysfunctional states, these also ideological dysfunction of being incapable of understanding what the world looks like from the shoes of the other one. And I think this is the terminal flaw of Western countries at the moment, that they're utterly incapable and unwilling to try to understand what are the actual security concerns of other participants in the international system, because you cannot take them out. The West can pretend that it is the entire world, but it will never be the entire world. and I believe that there's a deep psychological problem that stands in the way of actually rational analysis of the situation.
Yes. I'm really, it's a very important and a fundamental question. I think here again, though, we get tremendous variation. You have had governments, state leaders who, whatever their objectives and whatever their strategies, were highly rational, logical, calculating, like Bismarck, if you like. Sure, he started, 3 wars at least? Austria, Denmark, against France, and so forth. He had a very clear objective. He knew exactly what he was doing and why he was doing it. And he helped to cultivate a consensus among German political elites, right, which built upon fertile ground, visibly, in support of it. And he knew the other parties he was dealing with. I mean, his diplomacy was extremely skillful, and his bilateral dealings with everyone in Europe, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Britain, France, was based upon some case, first-hand knowledge. He spoke English very well. He spent a year in Birmingham, 9 months in Birmingham, a young man looking at British industry. And his roommate in college, where was it, Groningen, he went, anyway, was an American from Boston. And when he perfected his English, so he knew England, he knew Russia, he certainly knew Austria. So I think the question of willful ignorance, and partly it's willful, coming back to today, is perhaps a separate issue, an anthropological one, if you like, and a fascinating one in terms of social psychology.
Yeah.
Because as you use the word audacious, the readiness to make life and death decisions, which affect not only the lives and the deaths of other peoples, but the core interest and well-being of your own society, and to do so on the basis of cartoon images of the other parties involved is the height of irresponsibility, the height of incompetence, and opens the question as to just who these people are.
But it also opens the question, is it real? Do they believe their own lies because they seem so stupid? Or is it just, opium for the masses? I mean, we are the target of the propaganda, right? But the people in charge actually don't believe it. And they just know that in order to control a democratic society, you need to feed it a narrative. So the difference here is huge, right? The difference is between stupid people leading the state or cunning people leading the state.
I think it's a combination. Well, first of all, I mean, you find both, and sometimes you find both in the same government. In the United States today, it's a peculiar situation in that the overwhelming majority of people you might call the foreign policy establishment, and you can say the political class generally, or Washington political officialdom, do share a deformed character, vision of the world system and other powers, what those other powers are like, the character of their leadership, etc. In some instances, for example, the so-called neocons, the Blinkens, the Newlands, the Sullivans, and so forth, and many, many others in Washington now, it's kind of willful ignorance. And of course, if you are willfully ignorant, it is both convenient to you because you don't therefore put yourself in a position of having to fully think through the logic of the policies and the strategies you're promoting, right? And also you do begin to believe it. Well, let me put that somewhat differently. I think that was a good formulation. Yes, it is convenient. And of course, if you begin with a limited knowledge of the other parties, other states, and their leadership, you're all less likely to try to inform yourself and to use that information as the basis for the strategies you formulate and the policies you undertake. But the reality is today, in the United States, and I would say the same is true in Great Britain, the same is true in Germany, and the same is true in most of Western Europe, you have this sort of almost collective, which you might almost call a pathology, insofar as are sort of operating in reference to a fantasy world which does not match the actual world. I mean, look at the way Putin is depicted, for example. Or look at we spoke about a moment ago the totally unjustified and founded expectations that there'll be revolt of the Russian people against Putin if they feel the squeeze of economic sanctions, put on top of the the ignorance about the Russian economy.
Yeah, you're right about that, and so it must be a combination of both, and you also, I mean, of stupidity and cunningness from different people who differently interact with each other, and you also have this famous problem of the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? That the less somebody knows, the more they are confident that they're experts, and then those are the people who will most adamantly like push for a certain strategy because they an absolute lack of understanding of what's actually the case. And here we come back to war, because war then is the ultimate clash, right? It's the point where people are willing to start killing each other and even be killed in order to get a certain outcome. And war in this sense then always has a very sobering effect, because it shows usually that one of two sides was seriously miscalculating, sometimes both sides. But it never happens in war that a war validates both sides at the same time, because one of the two will at least find that its assessment was wrong, and that certain things that it believed can be done cannot be done. They cannot be achieved. So you get a bloody nose. The problem, of course, is when you have a proxy war like in Ukraine, the bloody nose is not your own. So the neocons and so on are still insulated from actual bodily harm that would alter their perception of reality. And these can then continue pushing. And I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm just saying that's the result of what war does. War proves some people wrong, but if those who have to admit that they were wrong are not the ones who actually are involved, then the effect is very little. Although it tickles in time little by little. The New York Times today admits that the counteroffensive in Ukraine was a failure. It took them, It takes them forever, but at some point, reality has to sink in.
Yeah, but let's pick up on the notion of the distance of leaders from actual events. Of course, in the old days, centuries, tribal leaders or would have to lead their tribes into combat. Even when we got organized societies, monarchs, would often lead their forces into combat. Alexander the Great was right in the forefront of the Greek forces, sort of who conquered half the known world, if you like. And that tradition carried on for some time. Of course, as war has become more and more remote controlled, right, the distance of leaders from actual combat, grows commensurately. And so the human factor becomes less and less important. And as a consequence, individual morality rooted in a sense of common humanity with other groups, other nations, other leaders tends to dissolve. It also dissolves for combatants. After all, if you're a drone operator sitting in Nevada, picking targets and pushing a button that unleashes a Hellfire missile from a drone in Yemen, or as it did in Afghanistan and Syria, you don't feel that human connection. It's just an object. It's a video game, if you like. And so morality becomes a very, very abstract consideration. Now, there is some evidence that some of these people who make these very concrete and specific decisions that do entail the life or death of subjects even thousands of miles away, some of them do suffer their own mild version of post-traumatic stress syndrome. But, post-traumatic stress syndrome only occurs because human beings are, by nature, not entirely reconciled with killing other human beings.
It hurts us.
If they were the kinds of people that if we human beings were the kinds of animals that some have postulated, with a drive to commit violent acts, we would suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, I guess is
yeah.
You know, they say, for example, in World War II, some historians note on the basis of exhaustive looking at memoirs, letters, etc., that among American troops on the European front, close to a third habitually did not fire their weapons or fire in the air. For two reasons. One, they were more concerned about survival than they were about killing the enemy. And so as soon as combat began, they just hit the ground and put their face in the earth and get hid behind trees in order to preserve themselves. Second, they were uncomfortable with the idea of killing an individual that you could actually see with a rifle. Of course, if you're talking about artillery, if you're talking about dropping bombs from airplanes, you're halfway between the soldier on the ground and the drone operator in Nevada.
Yeah, and we have social mechanisms in order to breach this problem to generals that their people sometimes don't want to kill the other people, right? I mean, fraternization with the enemy is in a lot of places punishable by death, right? So what we saw in the First World War over Christmas, that people came out and celebrated Christmas together, those are these human moments, and any kind of system of warfare always tries to prevent that. And we have sociological mechanism. I mean, the fact that fighters and soldiers often they paint their faces is this dramatic moment that you try to pretend not to be you. You're somebody else. Therefore, you are not responsible for the death of the others, right? We have psychological, and there's a good analysis, and there's very good research on all of these effects on the psychology of war. But all of that then plays together, and maybe we come back now to the overarching question of the morality, and also of the idea of giving law, of domesticating warfare. And you took out the book before because you wanted to go through the five what 5 points was it?
Just war.
Okay.
Yeah,
shall we do that?
The stipulates of just war,
which is ancient, right? It is just war theory was made by Saint Augustinus. I don't know why he's a saint, because he's more of a devil.
Let's come back to that for a moment, because Saint Augustine is given credit for something he did not author or mean. But let's.
Did he? Okay, teach me. I thought he actually wrote it.
Let's note the 5.
Okay. The 5 what? 5?
Okay. 1, there should be a persuasive explanation of why the state or the country has to go to war.
5 That's reasons for war. Okay.
Right. 2, nonviolent means, and essentially means self-defense rather than aggression or conquest, in practical terms. Then nonviolent means of resolving the underlying conflict should be pursued until proven futile. That's true. Then the minimum requisite force should be used. Proportionality, that's 3. Then enemy troops, and we get into the more specific in terms of how combat is actually conducted. Enemy troops should be treated humanely, now we would say in accordance with the Geneva Convention and the norms of society. That's 4. And then non-combatants, which means civilians, should be spared the dangers of combat whenever reasonably possible. That's 5. Now, of course, what's reasonably possible has to be today placed against the side the conduct of total war, as we said. I mean, if you're going to bomb population centers first because you want to destroy infrastructure and then to demoralize the entire country, and then it's not just a question of possible, it's a question of the very basic definition as to what is morally acceptable.
Yeah, and unfortunately, within international law, within the moral rationale for war, we also have one more principle that at any point in time can override any of these five, which is the argument of necessity. And we've seen that argument coming up again and again, and actually this is one of the reasons why von Clausewitz says that war always drives to the ultimate confrontation, because as soon as a state is about to lose or not to win, it will feel, and its leaders will argue that, well, under usual circumstances, we wouldn't be allowed to bomb Dresden or firebomb Tokyo. But right now, the situation is so incredibly horrible that right now, out of necessity, we got to do it. And that serves as a legal justification. And of course, as long as you win a war, you will never get any kind of punishment. I mean, the only real war crime that gets you hung from the neck is losing a war. No war crime while winning a war gets you hung. Never, ever.
Absolutely. Of course, much of this turns on how you define necessary. Mm-hmm. The integrity of national territory, one's core interest, and what's core. Now, the United States so broadly defines its national interests these days, right, that it's reached the conclusion that the expansion of NATO into the Ukraine and denying Russia the incorporation, well, initially they didn't even want to incorporate, but acknowledging Russia's concerns about the status of Russian populations in eastern Ukraine and Crimea, denying that is now defined as necessary to American national interest, and therefore justifies not just our involvement in the current war, but what we've done since 2014. Today, too, President Biden has stated that it is necessary to secure American interests that we contribute to the Israeli slaughter of Gaza's population.
Yeah. It's
so, I mean, necessary is a term or a concept that's really, made of rubber.
Which is why these leaders love it, right? It's the easiest thing in the world to just define whatever you want to do as essential to the nation or essential to, and then fill in the concept that currently is the raison d'etat, the reason for the state. Hannah Arendt properly analyzed that, national security is basically the raison d'etat for the Americans. You have other societies in which the Christian faith or the Muslim faith and so on then act as prime justification for the rule of the state. And in the US, it seemed to Arendt that the national security itself is the prime reason through which the state then legitimizes its own existence and its rule over the people. And you can see how in current government speech in the US, political speech, national security is always there. So not supporting Israel in Gaza would mean endangering US national security. Thereby, you create a link between two completely, utterly different concepts, but you have the justification, the rationale, and therefore violence happens.
Yes, of course, what's necessary for the current administration is two things. One is the United States since the breakup of the Soviet Union and potentially latently before, has defined in ultimate national well-being and security as an entire world in which are entrenched liberal political values in the peculiar form that you find it in most of the West, and the peculiar form of economic organization, neoliberal capitalism, in the form that the United States has given it and promoted, and which largely prevails in the collective West. And of course, this then opens up talk about a motive, means, and opportunity. Well, that means that the motive is omnipresent and universal, global, right? And the opportunity is there because not everybody has acceded to and has established the kind of public institutions in life which the United States believes it's destined to promote, and which is a condition both for world stability and American realization of its aims and purposes for which it was put on this earth. So that, unfortunately, I think is says. But the other dimension, of course, is what's necessary, is the belief in the White House that it has to do these things in Ukraine and in Palestine in order for Joe Biden to be reelected.
Well, yeah, very instrumental thinking.
Yeah, here we get into something very different. Of course, this is as stupid as many of the other presumptions, because I think it's becoming evident, and should have been for some time, that this sort of very weak candidate for reelection already suffers from all kinds of disabilities, is going to lose support because of what he's done in Ukraine and the outcome resulting from what he's done, and because of the disaffection of normally Democratic voters, youthful voters, over making the United States an accomplice to genocide. The genocide, by the way, as defined by the Geneva Convention, does not require that you industrially kill 6 million people of a particular ethnicity, race, or religion. In fact, it's not only a matter of magnitude in terms of numbers, but it's the elimination of a national culture, of a national identity, etc. Just anyone who sees this video can look it up for themselves. Just go on Wikipedia and put it in the convention, the genocide convention.
I mean, they know that.
In those terms, it's entirely appropriate to say that what Israel is doing in Palestine and in the West Bank as well as Gaza does indeed meet the definition of genocide as enunciated by the United Nations and representing the world community.
I mean, I know that the people who are in the driving seat in the West know this, because this is exactly what they are accusing China of doing to the Uyghurs, right? They're not saying China is industrially killing the Uyghurs. They're claiming that it is a genocide because they are trying to culturally uproot them, right? And they know that. And what makes this so hard for me, this cognitive dissonance, is that in the third week of the bombing of Gaza, the West, including Israel, had the audacity to sign a letter decrying China's genocide on the Uyghurs, while committing a genocide on the Palestinians. So this is then where I really wonder about morality. Can we still speak about the moral? And I mean, there are moral principles. I mean, and we talk about moral principles of non-combatant discrimination, and it is being discussed in the newspapers. But what we see is the utter non-adherence to the principles. Also in Yemen, and in an essay you pointed out also the attack on Raqqa, you know, in order to get rid of ISIS. Those were very, very inhumane slaughters that were committed by the West in full knowledge and awareness of the gravity of the hurt that they're putting there, or the Mosul and so on. Morality seems to exist as an idea, but not as a practice.
I think today's world is unique. The postmodern political world which we inhabit in the West is unique, and it has no precedent. And of course, this is a very complex, subject. But I think in order to try to understand it, one has to move beyond the study of politics, international relations, interspersed with economic studies, and rather think in terms of psychology, anthropology, sociology. The psychology should be both individual, collective, and normal and pathological. And I think one can make a very strong case that currently our political elites are living in a fantasy world, so divorced from reality, that it is indeed the manifestation of collective psychopathology. There's so many contradictions. They go actually beyond hypocrisy, because, as we said earlier, many of these people actually believe a lot of the nonsense which they're spouting, right? Actually believe the rationalizations for not only turning a blind eye to genocide in Gaza, but being an accomplice or accessory to it. In places like the United States, I'm talking about political elites in places like United States and United Kingdom. I think on the continent, it's distorted lens by some very timid people of a very little conviction, very little moral sense. I'm thinking of people like Schultz in Germany, Trudeau in Canada, the crowd in Brussels, from Ursula, von der Leyen to Mr. Borrell, Jungle Borrell, etc. I mean, these are very weak people of limited intellect, of weak character. There's careerists who have achieved positions 4 or 5 levels beyond their competence or qualification by character, and that has to be acknowledged. And I think in order to understand what's going on now and what has gone on in recent years on other issues like Iraq, Yemen, Afghanistan, and the hysterical anti-Russophobia actually centered on Ukraine.
Yeah, but the thing is...
Just one other quick point, and then I pass it back to you, Pascal. You raised an issue which we then have skirted about, is there a prejudicial racial factor involved, particularly when you talk about Gaza? That's another dimension which has to be taken into account, I think. We thought that it had ceased to be a significant factor in the perceptions and therefore the conduct of Western powers, certainly since World War II. And I think there's some considerable evidence that it's still there, living like a spore beneath the surface, if you like, which has begun to manifest itself again, not necessarily in the most virulent, concrete ways that it did in the past, but in terms of attitude and more in the way of abstention from and avoidance of making judgments which should be made, or making other judgments which are unjustified. It's hard to avoid the really disquieting fact that if the Gazans were not Arabs, right, if they were not among the others of what's called the Southern or non-Western world, the tolerance for what's going on would not be as cavalier as it is now. I think this is not to say this has been the sole factor or the determining factor, but I think it's hard to avoid the conclusion that it plays a role.
You're right. I do think it plays a role, but I'm a bit ambivalent on this one because of what we have seen over the last 30 or so years. In your essay, you're pointing out that the West never gave a rat's ass about what happened to the people in the Donbass between 2014 until 2022, right? There were 14,000 people who were killed in that period, and a lot of them actually civilians. And those were people of white, blonde people. And then of course, we see then how the West reacted when the Ukrainians were fleeing, and how this whole narrative of, oh, these poor blonde white refugees, we need to be so kind to them. We were never kind or to the people from the Arab world. So we do have a racial element, but on the other hand, the enemy and the kind of dehumanized enemy, not to the extent the Gazans. I mean, Gaza and Israel is on a completely different level, but we've had in the structural conflict between the US and Russia, we've had this Western dehumanizing of Russians as well, right? And trying to cancel them. And the Russians are white. I mean, not all. That's not true. Russia is a very multi-ethnic, multilingual, multicultural society, actually. But a good part of Western Russia, the societies there, especially around also Belarus and so on, those are white populations, and they have been ostracized, and Russophobia is a real thing. So there seems to be a racial element for sure, but it seems as if the West is also completely capable of throwing people out of the in-group, even when they look like us. And another example I have is Yugoslavia. You know, the Yugoslavs for a long time were not perceived as European, and Yugoslav refugees were not perceived as European refugees. It was very explicitly, they were othered out of Europe. In the minds of a lot of Europeans, to the point where my former boyfriend, when I showed him a picture of my friend from Croatia and Serbia, and I said, these two people, they are still getting a lot of racism in Switzerland. You know, they're both in Switzerland, they both have Swiss passports, but by the virtue of their last name, they still get racism. And he looked at them and said, but they're white. As a Taiwanese, he couldn't believe it. It's like, and you know, this the Europeans and whites have always been good at othering other whites from the in-group, and thereby create these another racial boundaries, right?
You're absolutely right. And it's a very good point, and also an important point. I mean, you know, let's run through the list of recent examples. I mean, the Bosnians, for example, was not quite European, although they had the absolutely same DNA as the Serbs and the Croatians, right? Because they were Muslim.
Yeah.
And their names indicated that, if you like. And whether you had blonde hair and blue eyes, not. In regard to Russia, because this has historical roots. I mean, the Russians, in effect, have always considered not quite Europeans, right? And there were those who always inclined to say they're really Asiatic, that they have been deformed in their mentality by the centuries of Mongol domination,
I mean, there is those racist narratives about the Russians.
Now you see that being revived in this hysterical, ridiculous sort of, Russophobia. I mean, sort of denying the right of Russians who qualified for the Paralympics to compete. These poor souls, crippled, who have spent God knows how many years training themselves and getting them psychologically overcome. Honestly, thinks absolutely nothing about denying them opportunity to participate simply because they're Russian.
Yeah, because you want to punish everybody.
An Asiatic, mongrelized Mongols, if you like, people who are not quite European. Now, it's not going to take the form that it did in the Congo. It's not going to take the form in Namibia. Right? It's not going to take the form, actually, of the Ottomans against the Armenians. But even there, I mean, the number who were outright killed is considerable. Nobody knows how many, tens of thousands. They were expelled and forced into the desert, where the Israelis want to force the Gazans into the Sinai desert. But it was a whole people that was displaced. The French did that in Algeria. They took whole tribal groupings of tens of thousands of people and literally uprooted them and moved them, or killed them. It took the 1950s to start doing that. But so those overt things are not going to happen. But as he said, they're a decision not to do things like to help the Bosnians, and to also accept things like what's happening in Gaza. Now, of course, the whole Jewish factor, the role of anti-Semitism for two millennia, we know all of that, culminating in the Holocaust, has created an exceptional and unique sort of psychology. But nonetheless, I mean, the egregious and overt actions that are being taken by Israel against the Gaza, one would have thought would never be simply glossed over, even justified. In the case of U.S. contributed to concretely, who would have thought that would be the reaction of the West? And I don't think there's any easy answer, any easy explanation. I think it's part of the collective, what I view as the collective sort of psychopathology, which manifests in multiple ways in contemporary Western societies, and which I think is shown in a lot of much of domestic public life, as well as in terms of attitudes towards external events. But let's not try and go down that road.
Yeah, we could. I mean, we could go into many different ways to try to make sense of this travesty that we didn't think possible. But instead of doing that, let's just also take this as a lesson that our collective capacity to do unspeakable crimes is here the way it always has been. And this is not a surprise, right? We know, I mean, the Holocaust, we know that. The Armenian genocide, we know that. There's the other genocides, we know that. There was the Stanford prison experiment, and there was the other one, the school, the wave, that famous experiment. We know that groups of people can very quickly be collectivized, and their entire thinking can be turned upside down. And they can be made to do unspeakable crimes to minority groups or groups that they have control over. So, and this is just another one of many examples that there's nothing that protects us from collective cruelty. When now I'm starting to struggle. Like, when does collective cruelty set in when there is a political motive behind it, a political purpose, or can it just be irrational? It just suddenly, once the pieces fall in line, it starts. I don't know.
There are always people, of course, who will encourage it because they have their own agendas and objectives.
Yeah, but those are just the pieces, right? They when they come together,
and then they exploit a kind of a breakdown, a partial breakdown of normal social standards, weakening of authoritative institutions, etc. The fascist phenomenon and the sudden appearance of fascist tendencies in Western societies, most pronounced, oddly enough, in the United States, among the old West, if you want to call it that, old democracies, is stunning, and it's not based upon ideology. There is no ideology. Trump and his people and the others, they have no ideology. What it is the stoking of emotion, and then the playing on it, classic fascist fashion, if you like, and you see it.
Persecution of your political enemies through the state and so on. All of these things
also, if you want insight into this phenomenon, I think the best study, well, two of them, is the superb book written back in 1951 by Eric Hopper, the longshoreman philosopher. In what was it called? The True Believer. And there you get in very pithy, direct, and extraordinarily insightful the whole dynamic, political, cultural, psychological, of fascism. And of course, he associated with radical, fanatical mass movements generally. The other is the really landmark essay done by Umberto Eco, the Italian writer, etc.
The Name of the Rose.
Yeah, in a classic article which was published in the New York Review of Books in June or July 1994, called Fascism, Fascism, which is the most rigorous and sort of systematic delineation of character of fascist traits and features that anyone has ever done. I mean, it surpasses anything done by political scientists or historians. And if you read those two things, it really helps to sharpen your understanding of certain tendencies today in the United States and in much of Europe. Both East, primarily East, to some extent in the West, and the potential for this phenomenon to metastasize.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree. I do think the West is currently in the process of deconstructing, decomposing the very thing that the people who are doing the decomposing say like they're protecting. In the name of democracy, you bury the entire thing, the entire idea, the entire concept, and the tragedy then is that people like you and we're witnessing this train wreck in slow motion, and there's nothing we can do. Like the oil, it's more like a tsunami. The water is rising, and you've already lost, because one thing you can do is try to run, but the water will rise further and further. You don't know if it's going to stop or not. But it's extremely scary. And the question to me then rather is, will the outside forces, the ones that don't participate in this lunacy, like the Russians and the Chinese and so on, they have their own versions of I wouldn't call it fascism. I don't think that the Russians or the Chinese are in a fascist mode. They're more in a control mode, control society. Whether that is going to work against it or whether it's going to feed into the fascistization of like more and more countries.
No, I think what you have in China and Russia, to a lesser extent in Russia, is a mild authoritarianism.
Yeah. But is it
what you don't have is the kind of nihilism which is coming to characterize Western society. It's not nihilism as a doctrine or such thing. It's a nihilism as a condition. And of course, when you move towards nihilism, which means no acceptance or obedience in terms of law, rule, norms, especially, norms in which one's conception, one is free to, the ultimate or the penultimate freedom is the freedom to choose whatever fantasy you want to live in. That's what's happening in the United States, if you like. And of course, in those conditions, those people or groups who know what they want, even if it's somewhat nebulous, even if it's just power, will triumph. It's a triumph of the will in a nihilistic society in which really nobody else has much will, thanks to the total concentration, the self-absorption, and total concentration on self.
I think this is also where you're right that psychology and is probably the only thing that can help us understand this phenomenon better, because what we see at the very same time is that the forces that do this fascistization that work on this project of the state are the ones that ascribe all of the things that they're doing to the forces that try to stop them, right? Anyone trying to push back, they describe them as fascist, they describe them as authoritarian, they try to fight them, they literally have the audacity, again, to the human rights discourse to abuse that. They have the audacity to claim that Donald Trump will weaponize the Justice Department against his political enemies, while the Justice Department has been weaponized to fight against him. I mean, again and again, and they ascribe like imperial hegemonic behavior to Vladimir Putin, while being hegemonic in the way that they push the Ukrainians into their early graves. It's schizophrenia, mass schizophrenia on an unprecedented level, I would say.
Yeah, because the one difference, and the crucial difference, between the sort of domestic tendencies in the West and what occurred in Europe, across much of Europe, we forget, in the 1930s, 1940s.
Spain, Italy,
Yeah, and all of Eastern Europe. You had fascist movements, and most of them did come to power. Portugal as well. Is that those movements, particularly in Italy and of course in Germany, were tied to an external policy of war and conquest. I think what you see in the West today is no impulse to fight wars for the sake of occupation, conquest, glory, anything of the sort. But you do, especially in the case of the United States, finding itself, confronting a situation in which their own fanciful notions of American identity and destiny and its supreme place in the world, the gap, the incongruity between that and actual reality has gotten so wide that it's leading us to do things which can lead to war, whether it's Ukraine or Taiwan, or whether it's the desire to attack Iran, which the neocons of the Biden administration had in mind when the October crisis of Palestine broke out. In other words, hoping that Hezbollah would intervene, and that would be an excuse. That would you blame it all on Iran, as if Iran directs all of these people, and then that would be justification for attacking Iran. There were people very high up in the Biden administration who had that intent, and it's the self-restraint on the part of Hezbollah and Iran that has denied them that, that opportunity. But anyway, generally speaking, though, this sort of divorce between the domestic moves in a direction of neo-fascism, or groups at least, that moving in the direction of neo-fascism, an external policy that you saw in the 1930s and 40s really doesn't exist. It's a small blessing, perhaps, but we should be thankful for it. It's hard to imagine any European country, any West European country, doing anything of the sort that it was accustomed to doing, outside their boundaries for, the last 500 years. That's all.
I mean, not that they're not trying, not that they're not trying,
but
not on that level. Not on that level anymore. So, but this is not because the Europeans got more moral or more civilized. It is because the other peoples learned how to defend themselves and how actually to stop this madness. And we see, I mean, in the 1960s and 70s, like the whole neo-colonial enterprise which was extremely successful, especially in Africa. Several Asian countries luckily took themselves out of that because they just didn't believe the lies that they were fed of, like how you have to structure your economies to be successful. And we're seeing that the Africans too are done with this. They are not going to follow this, and there's a good number of them who very clearly understand that the path to prosperity is to do the opposite of what they're told by the IMF, the World Bank, and so on, and develop their own industries and actually start guarding your natural resources and not sell them out. And but this will take time. This will take 50 or so years to properly translate into mass welfare. But I do think that also the African states are clearly done with this model. But the Europeans still try, and the Americans,
Yeah, well, but I think for the European segment, and that includes Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah.
Japan is a special case of its own. It is an existential thing, in the literal use of the term that has been, so misused, existential. Because it's their conception of the world and Western superiority, and the West, being the model and the pace setter and the leading force and the teleology of progress in the world, that they have to come to terms with. It's no longer, it's becoming less and less of a Western world. In the United States, though, there is this existential element, certainly even more so in the United States, because, Americans believe they were not only born in a state of original virtue, but were predestined to lead the world down whether as model or agent, which is another issue, down the road towards enlightenment. The United States, as well as being this sort of existential, it's a very practical issue, because as long as the country is committed to maintaining and entrenching American hegemony, broad term, it is going to find itself in situations where its impulse is to use force, but in which force is inappropriate, and in which its soft power, both cultural and even economic, is rapidly diminishing, right? And so it's in that disjuncture, incongruity, that the real danger lies because that generation, you see it, you feel, especially if you're living in the United States, and among the American political class, enormous tensions, internal tensions. And when you get people like the current crowd who are setting American external policy, they are capable of anything.
Yeah.
And this could explode in some kind of impulsive act, which would have really profound consequences. It's not clear that even that they're prepared to accept humiliating defeat in Ukraine. But let's
yeah,
it's something to be alert to.
Yeah, and I just shrieked because my coffee maker just switched itself off, and I think this is the sign that maybe we'll have to come to an end, because I know also you haven't had dinner yet, so I don't want to upset your wife again.
No, she wasn't. I told her that you would apologize, in fact, and she said, "Oh, it was not necessary. It wasn't serious."
It's not necessary, but it's appropriate.
No,
Okay.
she's always, my wife is on, she's always invited everywhere to give talks. She's given talks about every major American university and been invited to spend time in Paris and, well, she's half French, in Norway, in Morocco. She keeps getting these invitations on Aix-en-Provence. Wow. And China.
Yeah. We should have her here in that case. We should do a three-way discussion. We'll talk about this again.
She has other interests. By the way, you've done tremendously well with the kinds of people whom you've had on the show, and the way you've handled it, and the way they've presented themselves.
Thank you.
Even my last monologue in the end did reasonably well.
Yeah, and it just shows
that. What did it wind up with? About 40,000 at first. My God, I thought I was going to be in 3 digits. I got up to 5, and then 4. Well, and I mean, see, that's not too bad. It's not as good as my when I first appeared on the scene.
No, the thing is, your analysis, I think, is correct. That's why I want to talk to you. I think you're perceiving this right, and we perceive the reality we live in similar ways. And there's people who watch these recordings, and they, we create a bubble around where we see the world similarly, and the thing that we have to explain is how it is possible that others don't, right? But we are working on that, and one of the good things is we're authentic, right? I mean, this is just a discussion between two people who try to understand what the hell is wrong with everybody. And we got to do that.
Pascal, let's be realistic. And most of the people you've had on, over 60.
Yes.
Many
I shared.
You're at the very young end, and there aren't very many like you. I mean, there are a few. There's Max Blumenthal.
Yeah. Aaron Mate.
Yeah. But it's a really relatively small cohort, and don't forget, as time goes by, the people who have experienced something else in terms of political leadership, in terms of statesmanship, in terms of level of public discourse, are getting fewer and fewer. And so there's going to be no reference point in terms of people's experience and memory of anything different than what's been going on. And you can conceive of, you can be critical of it, and conceive of differences and so on, but in terms of attitudes and perceptions of the political class generally, this has potentially profound implications because nobody knows that you can do any better, or nobody has any sense of what the normal is anymore. Not everybody,
Yeah,
and not
yeah.
completely.
Demography is destiny, but there's two possible futures, and I don't know which one it will be, because if you see, you're absolutely right to point out that about almost half of the viewership of this channel is 65 plus, and it's clear trend: the younger, the less. But there's two things that can happen over time if we look at this not just as viewership, but as people who perceive the world in this in our way, is either as we go forward, it's just going to get less and less as this trend continues, or it remains stable, and it's actually just like experience in life itself that then educates people and gets them to see the world in this way, in which case the demographics would remain what it is. I don't know which one of the two it is. If it gets less and less, then, well, there will be a big war. There will be a very, very big war.
We got to remain hopeful. A lot of it's a matter of personality. I mean, people say, well, the glass is half full or half empty. It depends. I mean, people who are born optimistic will say, well, it's actually only 30% empty. Somebody who's born pessimistic will say it's 90% empty. I'm sort of in the latter category. I've always thought...
Michael, those are the moments when I turn things around and I tell them I don't care which one of the two it is, as long as it is filled with wine.
Yeah. And let me finish. Have you heard the story? It's been making the rounds among the Samizdat circuit, on the Samizdat circuit in Washington.
Mm-hmm.
The setting is, the time is June 2025. Okay. The setting is the Grand Savoy Hotel and Spa in Lausanne.
Mm-hmm.
And on the outdoor terrace, there are two people of Ukrainian background and extraction. First one is Alexei, and Alexei turns to his buddy, Grigoriev, and Alexei says, well, tell me, you like I creamed off millions from the aid that came into, and we were both members of Zelensky's circle, and he brought both of us over from his production team, before he became president. And we both creamed off millions, right? I wondered what have you done with yours? I estimate you made off at least with, let's say, 5 million. Grigoriev looks at him candidly. He says, "Well, 3 million of it went to booze and broads." And Alexei says, "And what did you do with the rest?" He says, "Well, I squandered it."
Yeah, that's how to take it.
In the mood, I'll give you another one. I'll give you another one from Ray McGovern, and Ray quotes his Irish grandfather saying, "Well, Raymond, you know why the sun never sets on the British Empire? Is because God doesn't trust the English in the dark."
Yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't. If I was God, I wouldn't. Keep it illuminated. Okay, Michael, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you. Keep well.
You too, Michael. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.